Hello class, welcome to this lecture on place, poetry, and the Noetics of nature in Martin Heidegger and Bruce Foltz. For the first time in our course, we're now going to be firmly planted in 20th century developments in philosophy and environmental philosophy. And this lecture is the last in a triptych that we began 2 weeks ago when we looked at the concept of physis in ancient Greek religion and philosophy, followed by notions of nature and spirit in German idealism and American transcendentalism last week. Here we'll be focusing on phenomenological and existential recoveries or rediscoveries of the idea of place and promising new avenues for engaging nature and spirit in poetry, poetics, and also important reconceptualizations of the whole tradition of Western philosophy on nature. The Michael Harrington article, The Rediscovery of Place from Sacred Place in Early Medieval Platonism, was assigned last week. Many of you are doing a presentation on a subsection of it. We'll start there today with Harrington's overall reading of Heidegger's philosophy of place, and from there we'll turn to Heidegger on the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, which is the clearest place where we find a Heideggerian philosophy and poetics of nature, as well as his later philosophy of the fourfold in an essay, The Thing, before turning finally to the preface and introduction to Bruce Foltz's excellent The Noetics of Nature, Environmental Philosophy, and the Holy Beauty of the Visible. We can begin this week with the recognition that place has power, which is something that Aristotle argued for when he said that topos has dunamis. Place is not a power to cause motion, but the power to make a thing properly present. For example, the fish cannot be a fish except in water, or appear to us as a fish except in water. In his physics, Aristotle defines place as the limit of the surrounding body, and Heidegger takes this in the broadest sense as the world that surrounds the thing. For example, when we think of the ancient philosopher Socrates, we think of the place of the agora, or the marketplace. For the agora is where Socrates is most Socrates-like. The Greek word for place is topos, and we encounter it all the time, i.e. topology. Every being has its topology, i.e. the places where it essentially is and becomes what it is. In fact, one could say topological thinking is an early version of ecological thinking. When we think about things in their places, we also think about the nature of these things and even their spirit or world. It seems that across ancient Greek philosophy, place was thought of as locale or abode or environment, whereas we moderns have tended to understand place as mere position in space. Place in the wider sense is locale, the German Ort, and we also speak of place in this sense, just not as frequently. Would it surprise you to learn that the concept of place as position in space is more recent and had to be invented? And what invented it? Well, the disciplines of geometry and arithmetic to start. With respect to this scientific concept of place, locale is older and more phenomenological. And this is because we never see things on Google Maps in nature, we only see them in their locale. Position is important, but is far from the whole of place. Indeed, all things in nature not only have a locale and locality, they also have a region, German Gegend. For example, the fish lives in water. Its region is the particular river, or lake, or sea, or ocean. Region means all the locations within a locality, and it has deep ecological significance within the life worlds of the inhabitants of particular locales. Region is much more important to life than space understood strictly as dimensions within a place. And this is because animals, plants, and early human beings never encounter mere space. They always only encounter regions and localities. From the basic concept of place, thought phenomenologically, in a way common to all living beings, we speak in the first instance of regions and localities, and never of points in a coordinate geometry system. According to Harrington, here reading Heidegger, the basic human relation to place in the sense of region and locality is not in the first instance dominion or control, but rather sparing, sheltering, and nurturing. The vintner or winemaker who tends the grapevines does not make the grapes, but by preserving and nurturing the vines, allows the grapes to come into being and ripen of their own accord. The vintner's field is only a calculation insofar as the vintner grows grapes for his business. Primarily, the vintner cares for the regions and localities within the place so as to nurture their physis, nature of growth. In this way, human cultivation and construction can free and spare the beings within their care to become what they are, the grapes of this particular vintage. Sparing here just means safeguarding beings in their unfolding. making sure the crop flourishes, for example, and does not fail. By sparing, sheltering, and nurturing localities within a region, human beings don't merely find sacred places here and there, but rather participate in their creation and maintenance. And this is seldom understood. We tend to think of so-called sacred places as just there in nature, an important historical site, perhaps where some important historical event took place. But in fact, sacred places in our landscapes are spared, sheltered, and nurtured as sacred places by human beings who deem them to be sacred, who relate to them in the mode of the sacred, and thus spare, shelter, and nurture them as outside ordinary cultivation, construction, or calculation. And here Harrington turns to Heidegger on sacred place. And the story's about to get a little freaky, because the minute we're talking about sacred places, we're also talking about places where spirit is encountered, spiritual places. Last week, Schelling mentioned locales in the Scottish Highland, in which the essence of nature and spirit are particularly intensely encountered. But when we speak about places where spirit or the spiritual is encountered, we are always close to both this world and the beyond, to life and death. The peculiar intersection of nature and spirit in this place. Such sacred places where the spiritual is encountered in various modes are endemic throughout ancient Greek literature, poetry, and religion. Just think of the entrance to the underworld that Odysseus finds in the far west, which is the liminal place in this reality that shuttles between it and spiritual realities, deep under the ground or accessing, like the shamanic world tree, worlds beyond our own. In part, this accounts for Harrington's turn in discussing sacred place to Heidegger's 1940s Parmenides lectures, in which he turns to give a reading of Plato's seminal text, The Republic, specifically its closing myth, the myth of air, one of world literature's first near-death experience reports. In Book 10 of The Republic, Plato recalls as the final allegory of cosmic justice the Pamphletian soldier Air's tale of an uncanny place in the afterlife, not heaven and hell, but somewhere in between. After 12 days of deathly slumber, the young warrior Air awoke on a funeral pyre just in the nick of time, and he bears with him a fabulous account of the places his psyche or soul had traveled in the dreamlike world of the beyond, a sequence of mysterious locales. The word Plato uses here is topon daimonia, uncanny places or spiritual places. First, a festive meadow with souls going up and down, trading places. Then a rainbow and spindle of necessity over which sirens sing along with the fates, and finally a desolate field with a river running through it. Significantly, in Plato's account of the myth of air, this sacred place is not exactly in this world, nor is it exactly in the spirit world. It is rather a liminal place as such, a topos tis daimonion, a place that is spiritual, daimonic, or uncanny, and so is a superlatively sacred place, although one we can't find until after we have died. Indeed, not even then, according to Plato's myth. Rather, after we have traveled for 1,000 years or more below the earth or throughout the heavenly bodies and their choruses, only then do we enter into this ultimately liminal sacred place, precisely as en route to being reborn into this world. We won't go too much into Plato's myth of air here, but simply extract from it the analysis of what a demonic, uncanny, sacred, or spiritual place really is. For this mention in Plato's Republic leads Heidegger to an interesting question. How does the demonic, or the spiritual, or the divine appear in place at all? Demonic comes from the Greek daimon, a spirit, usually the guardian spirit of the human being, or its double. Early Christian authors considered the Greek obsession with daimons and the demonic to be properly demonic. And hence we get the modern term demon, usually a horned satyr. The Greek term itself lacked this malevolent character. Indeed, it was beyond good and evil, insofar as there were both beneficent and baleful demons. Not only Plato, but also Aristotle speaks of the demonic as what is excessive, astounding, and difficult. Indeed, the activity of philosophy, becoming a philosopher, is demonic in this sense. That is more closely related to what is divine and therefore in some sense opposed to the homely, to what is familiar, the oesia, or homestead, what lies all around us every day. Heidegger in these lectures is careful not to understand the Greek spiritual or demonic as what is removed, strange, frightful, or alienating. It's also not merely the pneumatic or spiritual breath that animates or insufflates this life. Rather, the very being, character, or truth of the human being's locality, its abode, under the sky, upon the earth, in between mortality and divinity, is by definition demonic, that is spiritual. The demonic or spiritual presides wherever we see the strange and the extraordinary within the everyday and the ordinary. Human existence in nature and civilization is in this sense demonic, i.e. spiritual, and the key is to sight or see the demonic in this world. The etymology of the word demonic itself suggests a special kind of seeing or viewing, showing or indicating, from Greek dio or diontes. According to Heidegger, the ordinary is what allows the demonic, the spiritual, to become present. It is the place of the demonic. The daimons, that is, the spirits in the spirit world, are thus the self-showing ones. More simply, if we want to see and experience the divine, we have to be open first to the spiritual, which the Greeks called demonic as what points to it. In the Christian or Islamic experience of the divine, this realm of the demonic or spiritual might be understood as the angelic. What Heidegger finds in the Greek term divinity itself, theos or theon, is this same etymological root from to look, theomai. So what it is about sacred places or spiritual places that makes them important for the apperception of the spiritual, that it is in precisely these places or locales that the soul, suke, nature, phusis, and the divine or to theon come to presence in an exceptional sense. And this is the divine seeing that spiritual or sacred places grant us. For Heidegger, our being is determined through a relation between divine being and ourselves. We are the mortals, and then there are the immortals, and also the God. More specifically, human beings are distinctive for Heidegger because they see along with divine seeing. Part of their nature is spiritual in this sense. Because our vision is in the first instance demonic, that is sacred or spiritual, only thus can it become divine, that is absolute seeing or knowing of being itself. And it is in this sense that the goddess Aletheia reveals two pathways to the philosopher Parmenides. Two basic ways of seeing the world. There is the path of being in its very being or truth, and the path of non-being, untruth, appearance, and delusion. Whichever path we are on in a given moment in this life, place is extremely important to spiritual or divine perception and seeing. In fact, sacred places are the condition of possibility of divine seeing, its manifestation. In Heidegger's terms, place is what originally gathers and holds what belongs together. Sounds esoteric, but just think of the difference in what you see in beautiful and sacred places versus ordinary or abused ones. Next, there is an intimate connection between language, especially liturgy, and sacred place. We do not simply await the presence of the gods or God in a sacred place, we also name those divinities in hymnal song, that is, religious poetry. There's an intimate link between sacred place and language, especially the poetic and religious use of language. In sacred places, very often invoked into language are the divine presences that dwell within them, and this is a key feature in all indigenous and world religions. Even places that are haloed by an austere and commanded silence reveal language in a different sense, that is through its suspension or the language of nature or spirit itself beyond human words. Now, within this question of language and sacred place, we can note that the English word God, as well as its German cognate Gott, derive from the same Indo-European root, a root that Heidegger understands as meaning the invoked one. Language transcends its ordinary everyday function and becomes sacred language when the name as the first word lets what is designated appear in its primordial presence. This invocational function is an earlier meaning of the word myth. Think of myth merely as fanciful fable or untrue story, but what it actually means in its etymology is not a tall tale, but rather a saying, a saga or legend, i.e. a naming that lets things appear in their primordial essence. Localities and regions in nature and culture are superlatively important for the manifestation of the holy or sacred, and any decline in our care for sacred places is matched by a decline in our relation to the language of the sacred. All daimonic and spiritual places are so important because they are those where the essence of being comes to presence in an eminent sense. For in a different way, language in large measure constellates sacred places and is the precinct or temple that is the house of being. The temple too makes divinity present, and the sacred precinct would not be sacred unless the divinity consented to be present. and so its presence is, in itself, the extension and delimitation of the precinct as a holy precinct. Harrington next turns from Heidegger's Parmenides lectures to those of the early 1940s, essays such as The Thing, Building, Dwelling, Thinking, and The Question Concerning Technology, noting that the common theme across these works is that the divine, the sacred or spiritual, has in some sense withdrawn and departed. This has not caused Heidegger, however, to abandon his study of the sacred. The rest of Harrington's readings here look at these later essays for a deeper understanding of what sacred place is all about. And we ourselves will return to the essay The Thing after looking at Heidegger's readings of Hölderlin, also from the later 1930s and earlier 1940s. So far, we've been talking about Heidegger's take on sacred places or spiritual places. The essay As When on a Holiday tackles a related but slightly different theme, that is sacred time and nature, rather than merely sacred space or place, and its spiritual or demonic aspect. And once again, just as we neglect the difference between position and place, and between ordinary and extraordinary places, so we also tend to neglect the difference between everyday time and extraordinary time. Historically speaking, we all observe extraordinary places as well as extraordinary times. We tend to call these latter holidays, and define holidays as days of reprieve from work, without sufficiently noting how underscored they are in all of our religious, philosophical, and poetic traditions. The holiday is essential not simply because it's a leisurely relaxation from our ordinary routine, a time to do nothing, but because it's through holidays, which structure all of our sacred calendars, that we make time for getting closer to nature and for experiencing spirit in new ways. This makes sense intuitively, and now, by reading this essay of Heidegger on the poet Hölderlin, we'll learn why. The whole essay consists in a line-by-line exposition of Hölderlin's poem As When on a Holiday or Feast Day, a poem that, as Heidegger begins the essay, was written in 1800. Since then, and 1937 or 8 when Heidegger writes, and to the present day, the open insurrection of modern world history has begun. Its course will force a decision concerning the future character of the absolute domination of man over the whole terrestrial globe. Hölderlin's poem, however, still waits to be interpreted. I had my friend Owl read a while back this whole essay by Heidegger. She definitely waxed a little bit too romantically, but the reading of the initial poem nevertheless gives a nice sense of the enthusiasm that lies behind Hölderlin's poetry. You could either read the essay this week or listen to the whole thing read to you by her.
As when on a holiday.
It begins, as when on a holiday, to see the field, a countryman or landman goes out at morning. The first stanza brings us to see a countryman standing out of doors in the fields on a holiday morning. Here all work has ceased, and the god is nearer to man. We've actually encountered bits of this poem before when we introduced with Heidegger 3 concepts of nature: the totality of beings in the world as created beings, according to the Judeo-Christian conception, the body or bodily life, the elemental, nature itself, and also nature as presencing, that is, as in itself spiritual. For our purposes, the key line of the hymn, "But now day breaks, I waited for it and saw it come, and what I saw, may the holy be my word, for she herself, who is older than the ages, and above the gods of Occident and Orient, nature is awakening with a clang of arms, and from high ether down to low abyss, according to firm law, as once begotten out of holy chaos, inspiration, the all-creative, again feels herself renew." And this is the experience of the landman or countryman who goes out at morning, after a thunderstorm, to see the fields. Heidegger comments, the inner movement of these 3 lines strives towards the final word, nature. And for Heidegger, the whole poem is fundamentally poetizing from and of nature. Nature both reveals itself to the countryman and educates the poets, and is wonderfully all-present. This is again a pretty romantic conception of nature, as we saw also in Emerson last week. Heidegger comments, she is present in everything that is real. Nature comes to presence in human work and in the destiny of the peoples, in the stars and in the gods, and also in the stones, growing things and animals, as well as streams and in thunderstorms. However, she can never be found somewhere in the midst of the real, like one more isolated actual thing. The all-present that is nature is also never the result of combining isolated real things, or even the totality of what is real is at most but a consequence of the all-present that is nature. In this poetic conception, dating back to ancient Greek thought, nature is the origin of the all, including the gods. The wonderful that is nature withdraws from all producing and nevertheless passes through everything with its presence. And that is why, as the poet sings, nature educates in a light embrace. What is merely real in our everydayness, that is work, culture, society, civilization, history, at times attracts us and at times repels us. And yet ultimately all these dimensions of the merely real, our lives in human civilization and culture, are from and by nature, who contains all movements of the real in its all-powerful presence. Nature does not have to borrow her power from somewhere else. She herself is that which bestows power. Heidegger asks, does nature therefore resemble a god or a goddess? The goddess of nature? Not exactly, for if this were so, then nature, which is, after all, present in everything, even in the gods, would be measured by the divine and would not be nature any longer. Does the divine or God transcend nature and give nature its nature? Or is nature that which endows the divine with its divinity? This is an ancient dilemma known in Plato's dialogues as Euthyphro's dilemma. We do not yet know how to answer this difficult question of the relative priority of nature or the divine, nature and spirit. And we've been working on it for weeks at this point, and no closer to finding a solution. So let's, along with Heidegger and Hölderlin, attempt a new approach. What do the poets say about nature? What is the poetic projection of the fundamental essence of nature? According to Heidegger and Hölderlin's poem, the beauty of nature is captivating and enrapturing, an all-pervasive unity, both of highest heaven and of deepest abyss. That is, since nature itself stretches between ether and abyss. All-present nature captivates and enraptures. In more philosophical terminology, the sacred spaces that we encounter as nature are entrancing, awe-inspiring. And the sacred time in which we encounter sacred space, that is, the spirituality of nature, enraptures us and seems to elevate us beyond the merely real that is our time. The coincidence of captivation and rapture, that is space spacing and time timing as nature, is for Heidegger the essence of the beautiful. And in the words of the poem, nature is called divinely beautiful because within her the divinities, that is the gods and the goddesses, appear and come closest to awakening the semblance of captivation and rapture. And yet even the gods are not capable of the pure beauty that is nature, for whatever beauty the gods have is from nature. Of course, realizing they are not gods, poets are nevertheless drawn into nature's own educating and light embrace. So the poem goes on, when she seems to be sleeping at times of the year up in the heavens or among plants of the people, the poets' faces also are mourning. They seem to be alone, yet are always divining. Heidegger interprets this as meaning that poets persist in their belonging to nature and divining from nature, even in mourning and resting, very much like nature. Ultimately, poets are those who correspond to the wonderfully all-present, to the powerful and divinely beautiful, i.e. nature itself. At this point, having discussed only the first 3 stanzas of the poem, Heidegger enters upon a fundamental digression on the very concepts of nature and spirit, of course very relevant for our course. He notes that one usually encounters nature in the familiar distinctions of nature and art, nature and spirit, nature and history, the natural and the supernatural, the natural and the unnatural. In all these distinctions, nature always signifies a particular realm of being, and one might, at this point, wish to posit nature, as named in the poem, as basically identical to spirit. Are nature and spirit fundamentally identical? Is there coincidence at the same time an identity? This is how Hölderlin's friend Schelling, who we studied last week, understood nature, as undergoing the active essence of identity as spirit. And Heidegger will go on to concur with this terminology, just not in the sense of identity. There is in fact a difference between nature and spirit and a priority of nature in Heidegger, a fundamental difference which is prior to any identification of nature and spirit. Part of the problem here is the limitation of the very word nature. It doesn't quite name adequately what the poem describes. What Heidegger is going to attempt to do is to understand nature as physis, as we learned last week, the revealing that loves to conceal itself, as well as designating growth and development, or the self-motion of beings from nature, and spirit as difference and development. But this distinction of nature as a process or physis from spirit as differentiation and development within nature is going to need some explaining in the context of the poem. And this is what Heidegger next provides. Nature, natura, is called physis in Greek, and it is a fundamental word of thinkers the beginning of Western philosophical thought. But the translation of phusis by Natura already transposes subsequent elements into the beginning and replaces that which is proper to the beginning with something alien to it. We have lost the basic experience of nature as phusis that was more or less shared in archaic cultures. For them, phusis signified first growth, an emerging and an arising, a self-opening which, while rising, at the same time turns back into itself what has emerged and so shrouds itself. In this sense, the archaic notion of phusis begins as the condition of possibility of all emergence and all clearing, or lighting of beings in their presencing. And according to Heidegger, Hölderlin's poem, although this was not exactly Hölderlin's philological intention, resounds precisely with this earlier Greek meaning of phusis. This is why the poet struggles to provide a name for nature and ends up settling on the holy. Again in the key lines, "But now day breaks, I waited and saw it come, and what I saw, may the holy be my word." Daybreak in the poem here signifies the coming of a divining nature that has been at rest. That is a re-spiritualization or awakening of the divinity in nature. And in another poem, at the source of the Danube, Hölderlin also names nature the holy. There, we name you, compelled by the holy, we name you nature, and new as from a bath, from you emerges all that is divinely born. And in the drafts for these poems, Hölderlin even crossed out the word nature, which is a sign for Heidegger that Hölderlin was searching for a better and deeper word. We can say that in Hölderlin's Poetics, in awakening, nature unveils her own essence as the holy, but what exactly we mean by awakening, unveiling, nature, essence, or the holy is not that easy to divine. According to Heidegger, in Hölderlin's poetry, nature is older than the gods, and thus also the spirit world, for she herself is older than the ages and above the gods of Occident and Orient. This nature, which Hölderlin understands in the sense of phusis, unnamed, is now, in the experience of the poet, awakening with the clang of arms. Nature is older than the ages, the epochs, eras, eons, but not older than time. Rather, nature is both time and what gives time, space and what gives space, or the whole of the time-place-space of the universe. Nature is not above the gods in an isolated realm, but is both higher and deeper than the gods and the source of the divine. And this is why Hölderlin calls nature the holy, for she is that in light of which everything that is holy or sacred derives its nature, essence, or holiness. For Heidegger, the holy is not holy because it is divine, rather the divine is divine because in its way it is the holy, i.e. given from nature. Nature, as chaos, is the holy itself, and the all-creative, animating force in nature is spirit. Hölderlin as well calls chaos the holy in this stanza. And for Heidegger, this means that according to the poem, the holy as chaos is the essence of nature. Again, the crucial line, from high ether down to low abyss, according to fixed law, as once begotten out of holy chaos, inspiration, the all-creative, again feels herself renew. Creative in Hölderlin's poem is, according to Heidegger, spirit, the word spirit itself being part of the word inspiration. What is inspired is irradiated by spirit. As the all-present, all-creative one, nature inspires everything. She herself is inspiration. Nature as spirit can inspire only because she is spirit. Now this is not quite contradictory to what Heidegger said earlier, when he underlined that Schelling's conception of the identity of nature and spirit is basically correct. It does not fully account for the priority of nature in the forms of spirit. In the statement, nature is spirit, nature takes priority as the source, or origin, and even the pure transcendental. Spirit becoming a manifestation of nature, or that through which nature is differentiated. I might object here that Heidegger is reading altogether too much into the poem, for so far by the third stanza, Hölderlin has only referred to spirit in the language of inspiration, in German Begeisterung. However, this spiritualization is named the all-creative within the all-present, or the holy itself within chaos. To truly understand the poetic relation of nature to spirit in Hölderlin's poem, we need to read the next two stanzas. And as fire gleams in the eye of the man who has conceived a lofty design, so once more, by the signs, the deeds of the world now, a fire has been kindled in the souls of the poet. And what came to pass before, though scarcely felt, only now is manifest. And they who smiling tended our fields for us in the form of servants, they are known, the all-living, the powers of the gods. Do you ask about them? In the song their spirit blows, when from the sun of day and warm earth it awakens, and storms that are in the air, and others the more prepared in the depths of time, and more full of meaning and more perceptible to us, drift on between heaven and earth and among the people. Now the second reference to spirit in the poem. The thoughts of the communal spirit they are, quietly ending in the soul of the poet. Nature as all creative inspiration or spiritual is, in other words, what is thoughtful, or in Greek, noetic. When we ask after the spirit of nature, we're asking to think nature for a noetics of nature. The communal spirit, or in German, gemeinsame Geistes, is the realization of thought in nature, and what comes to rest in the poet from which he sings. As communal, Heidegger underlines that spirit is essentially the unifying unity within nature, or nature's community. We could even say here nature's ecology. And Heidegger goes on, spirit holds sway as the sober, though daring, setting apart from one another, which sets everything that comes into presence into the well-delineated boundaries and structures of its presence. And so, as unifying the spiritual or noetic element of nature is at the same time the delimiting, the differentiating, and the bounded, we cannot understand the spiritual without entering into essential thinking, noesis, since it is this that sets apart, and so is able to think together that which belongs together of spirit. The spirit is therefore essentially in its thoughts the communal spirit. In the basic definition of spirit, it is the realm of belonging, of unity and unifying amidst difference and differentiation. Spirit is thus defined as the realization of nature in community or in ecology. Although only human communities do this strictly in Heidegger, you might note here that this definition is broad enough to include natural communities as well. In the first instance, the highest and eldest gods, or the elemental itself, Aether and Abyss, are spiritualized in the poem in Nature's Awakening. Here, Aether is the name for the father of light and the all-enlivening, lightning air, and Abyss means the all-enclosing, which is borne by Mother Earth. So Aether and Abyss is another name for the dyad of earth and sky. However, it is a yet more archaic name of the most extreme domains of reality, the supreme divinities. In Awakening through nature, both Aether and Abyss are thoroughly spiritualized by inspiration. Both are the region in which other beings in the world become able to experience inspiration, not as mere entrancement or intoxication, but always according to firm law. This firm law is in Greek Nomos, which can mean both natural law and song. At the one extreme, there is nature as holy chaos, and in the other, nature as a bounded ecological community, or even a spiritual history. Why do we speak of spirit at all here and not just stick to the language of nature? Because spirit is the realm of co-presencing within which particular beings from nature exist in community and relate to each other within nature. Nature itself is the transcendental, pure and simple, yet always experienced within immanence or immediacy to all particular beings within it. Pure immediacy, however, or the truth of being itself, is as impossible for the gods as it is for mortals. Nature is both pure immediacy and mediating all presence, and thus at the same time nature unfolds as strict mediation or law, nomos. Heidegger asks, how do chaos and nomos, law, go together? For the Greeks, Hölderlin and Heidegger, chaos does not signify just lawless confusion or wilderness, but, quote, the yawning, gaping chasm, the open that first opens itself, wherein everything is engulfed. Chaos is, in other words, the holy itself, and nothing that is real precedes this opening, but rather always only enters into it. And in doing so, all beings as spiritual realize nature as whole and integral. Heidegger comments, nature's originary wholeness gives a gift to everything that is real by virtue of its all-presence. It confers the grace of its own abiding presence. But the primordial wholeness which thus grants holiness still enshrouds all fullness in itself. In other words, nature as the immediate holds in itself the fabric of the essence of all, and thus it is precisely unapproachable by any individual, be that a god or a man. The holy or holy nature as the unapproachable renders every immediate intrusion of the mediated in vain. For the holy confronts all experience with something to which it is unaccustomed, and so deprives it of its ground. Deranging in this way, the holy is the awesome itself, but its awesomeness remains concealed in the mildness of its light embrace. Although poets, according to their being, belong to the holy and think the reality of everything real, that is spirit, and although they are thus essentially spiritual themselves, they must at the same time also remain immersed and captive within what is real. And so, in another poem, the only one, Hölderlin sings, the poets, even the spiritual, must be worldly. Nevertheless, the all-living, the powers of the gods, are everywhere within nature in the form of servants. Back to our poem, and they who smiling tended our fields for us, in the form of servants they are known, the all-living, the power of the gods. In song, or here now Nomos, their spirit blows. The essay is of course getting extremely complicated at this point, but we must ask what the relation is here between spirit and song. On this, Heidegger comments, in song and only in song, that is poetry, does spirit join itself to the meditative structure of the holy. But the spirit does not blow in every singing. That only occurs in song. Song, in this sense, must spring from the awakening of nature, from high ether down to low abyss. For when song shares in the awakening inspiration, then what wafts in it is the breath of the coming of the holy. And so Heidegger completes his explanation now of stanzas 4 and 5, the thoughts of the communal spirit they are, quietly ending in the soul of the poet. In a way, spirit becoming what reminds us of the unifying unity of nature, precisely by being differentiated in each and every one of us, either through thinking or through poetizing song. I'm going to leave Heidegger's essay on Hölderlin's hymn As When on a Holiday here. And I realize it got very difficult at the end, so no worries if you didn't quite catch all the ins and outs in the last couple of minutes. In conclusion, however, we can note that in Hölderlin's hymn, there's two basic conceptions that prevail. One, nature is the holy itself, prior to the spiritual worlds that it separates and differentiates. And two, that despite this separating, differentiating process throughout the world, inhabited by particular beings, and because of nature, all remains and is intimate. And yes, we live in a world defined by exteriority and various spheres or bubbles of ecology or community, but nevertheless, nature as the origin and source of all this traverses and is intimate to everything. Ultimately, everything is by and from physis or nature. Or as Heidegger puts this, everything is only by shining forth out of the intimacy of the all-present. The holy is intimacy itself, it is the heart. In its coming, the holy, older than the ages and above the gods, grounds another beginning of history. For it is the holy that primordially decides in advance concerning human beings and gods, whether they are and who they are, and how they are and when they are. And so nature, understood as the holy, is the primordial word of Hölderlin's poetry. Alas, we have to break off here because we still haven't understood and experienced the holy or the sacred. But when we do so eventually, perhaps through reading poetry, perhaps through thinking along with Heidegger's essay, we will return, according to Heidegger, from the Western Latinized concept of nature, natura, beings as a whole, to the very emergence of nature as physis and as truth or spirit, aletheia. Now back to Harrington for a minute. As he points out, Heidegger never ceases to meditate on the sacred or holy in his later writings. And it is these later writings, rather than his elucidation of Hölderlin's poetry, that have had the deepest impact on environmental philosophy, especially the essays Building, Dwelling, and Thinking, which we won't cover here, and the essay The Thing from 1949 to 50, first delivered as a lecture as part of the Bremen and Freiburg series, and available in the Hofstadter translation of Heidegger, Poetry, Language, and Thought. And now in the essay The Thing, Heidegger provides the clearest summation of his later philosophy, when he writes, "Human beings dwell in that they await divinities as divinities, and they do not mistake the signs of their absence. Waiting for absent gods does not deny the possibility of interaction with them, for places may still gather the gods into them, and so become sacred places, but they gather the gods as absent." The most basic premise of this essay, things themselves are sites where the four elements of the world, that is earth and sky, divinities and mortals, this is known as the fourfold in later Heidegger, interact and mirror each other in a gathering round dance. Whole books have been written trying to figure out what on earth Heidegger is on about in his meditations on the poet Hölderlin, and also in his later esoteric philosophizing on the thing and the fourfold. We don't have time to get into all these complex debates here. We can point out in the broadest sense that according to Heidegger, everything in the world, and even human created things such as this jug, are mediated in their presencing for us from and by nature in some sense. The jug is a physical thing here made of glass and shaped into the form of a jug by human making. It can never, however, appear as a jug except to human beings dwelling upon the earth, always disclose the things of the world and each other in particular ways, that is, by spirit or thought. Like all of human experience, the jug is stretched between earth and heaven, and its function as a jug is to contain and to pour liquid, which it can perform either in the ordinary everyday mode of a jug for drinking, or in the mode of a special jug, a sacred or consecrated jug, intended to realize a ritual that involves both us mortals and our experience of the world, as well as the world of the divine or the sacred. If I take the jug to a sacred place and perform a kind of ritual with it, and then pour libations from the jug, say, in honor of the earth, the spirits of nature, or the gods, then it becomes a consecrated jug, and so a site for the mirror play of the world, the very interaction of beings who dwell upon the earth like humans, the manifestation of the divine or the spiritual in nature. Now, according to Heidegger's analysis of the poet Hölderlin, we live in an era where the gods or the experience of the divine itself is in flight. As Harrington comments, consecration is no longer possible for us, or at least not as possible as it once was. And this is because we lack a historical sense of ourselves as a spiritual people from and by nature. Nevertheless, the jug may still retain a sacred character in certain instances. The jug itself can never be entirely responsible for its gift, since it does not produce the drink that it pours. It receives the drink as the prior gifts of rain from the sky and the well springs of the earth. And these prior gifts reunite mortals and gods that are separated in the different purposes of the outpouring. So in the first half of the essay, The Thing, we move from a most everyday significance of a thing, the jug, to its possible use in the gift of the outpouring earth and sky, divinities and mortals dwelling together all at once. And according to Heidegger, all things are capable of mirroring the world of nature and spirit in this way. Heidegger has been accused both in the Hölderlin essay and in the essay The Thing of indulging in mere mystical wordplays and even a kind of hieroglyphic thinking, which is no longer philosophy but rather a peculiar form of poetizing proper to Heidegger. As Rudiger Safransky writes in his biography of Heidegger, thought forms like these must be considered as playful, obscure, arabesque-like reflections that might give food for thought but hardly for thinking, like the tattoos on the body of Queequeg, the harpooner in Melville's Moby Dick. Nevertheless, we should not desist from seeking the profound meaning of Heidegger's metaphors here, and we should not take his essential thinking too lightly. Most egregiously, Heidegger speaks in this essay of the thinging things of the worlding world. And what he intends us to understand here is that things are never mere things, but always in a process of thinging, that is, appearing as things. Furthermore, the world is not merely a noun or the totality of beings within the world, objective nature. Rather, the world is always also in a process of worlding for enworlded beings. So he can write revealingly for some and obscuring for others that thinging, the thing stays in the united four, earth and sky, divinities and mortals, and in the simple one-fold of their self-unified fourfold. The very structure of the thinging things of the worlding world, in other words, from and by nature, always involves a certain type of experience of earth and sky, divinities and mortals, a spiritual unifying, as well as a differentiating and delimiting into the boundaries of presence. The four major players in all thinging things of the worlding world are the earth, as the building bearer, nourishing with its fruits, tending water and rock, plant and animals, the sky as the sun's path, the course of the moon, the glitter of the stars, the year's season, the light and the dusk of day, the gloom and the glow of night, the clemency and inclemency of the weather, the drifting clouds and the blue depth of the ether. The divinities are the beckoning messengers of the Godhead or God, and out of the hidden sway of the divinities, the God emerges into what he is, which removes him from any comparison with beings that are present. And the mortals are human beings. They are called mortals because they can die. To die means to be capable of death as death, where death for human beings is the shrine of the nothing, that is, of that which in every respect is never something that merely exists, but which nevertheless presences, even as the mystery of being itself. And our last slide on this very difficult part of Heidegger, In the end, he'll define the thinking things of the worlding world, or the naturing of all natured nature, as a kind of mirror play or even round dance of the event of being, which he calls Ereignis, often translated as the event of appropriation. The appropriating mirror play of the simple onefold of earth and sky, divinities and mortals we call the world. The fouring, the unity of the four presences as the appropriating mirror play of the betrothed, each to the other in simple oneness. The fouring presences as the worlding of the world, the mirror play of the world is the round dance of appropriating. And everything as a thing, but stays, gathers, and unites the fourfold, the things world. Men alone, as mortals, by dwelling, attain to the world as world, and only what conjoins itself out of world becomes a thing. This part of Heidegger is, believe it or not, actually a lot easier to teach in person. In many ways, the critics are right. These passages are almost impossibly obscure, so odd that they creep up on us in essays by Heidegger which are otherwise extremely concise and measured. I imagine that anyone who does attempt to read Heidegger's essay on Hölderlin or The Thing this week will find by the time they get to these more difficult and subtle points concerning nature and spirit that the essays themselves are in fact quite illuminating. Perhaps also that they cannot, by the very definition of their subject matter, be taught. Rather, they must be read and experienced for oneself. Finally, and most significantly this week, I want to turn to a marvelous, fairly recent book by Bruce Foltz, The Noetics of Nature, Environmental Philosophy, and the Holy Beauty of the Visible. To be sure, at times, especially to the beginner, Heidegger's own writings can seem perversely obscure. Nevertheless, Heidegger has had a massive impact on environmental philosophy in the 20th and 21st centuries, especially as regards conceptions of nature and spirit. And so I was very pleased in prepping this course to find a recent, lucid and fascinating book by Bruce Foltz, from which we'll read the preface and the introduction. Foltz also serves to bring us back to the world of spirit and nature in Byzantine Greek Orthodox Christianity, which we covered briefly in week 3. His writing is also extremely beautiful, lucid, and his analysis pretty amazing. For the beginner at least, one could even say that Foltz does Heidegger better than Heidegger, and also with source materials that are even more interesting. In fact, Foltz makes no secret of his predilection for Heidegger's thinking as extremely helpful in deciphering how nature and spirit function in Orthodox Christian faith. It could even be that in an Eastern Christian atmosphere, Heidegger wouldn't have broken his philosophy so decisively from Christianity. I hope that we can count on Foltz to decode Heidegger a bit for us here and to make his notoriously obscure thinking more accessible to everyone. Foltz's path is indeed a very interesting one, leading from Heidegger and environmental philosophy back to Greek Orthodox Christianity, beginning his preface by quoting His Holiness Bartholomew, Archbishop of Constantinople. Bartholomew, just like Pope Francis is called the Green Pope, is called the Green Patriarch, because he was perhaps the first leader of any Christian body to speak out strongly, exercise effective leadership, and sponsor a variety of practical initiatives to address the environmental problems that may end up defining our era. He once wrote, "The crisis that we face is, as we all know, and as we all readily admit, not primarily ecological, but religious. It has less to do with the environment and more to do with spiritual consciousness." Foltz finds this passage extraordinary. Not primarily ecological, but religious, as we all know, and as we all readily admit. He notes it has taken him 3 decades to reach the point at which these statements could carry much plausibility at all, perhaps even make sense to more than a very few. Perhaps it is clearly no longer just about smog. Much more plausible now is Bartholomew's claims that it is a crisis concerning the way we imagine the world, ultimately over the image we have of our planet. And he notes that the Greek word for image here is icon, a word used to name extraordinary images in Byzantine sacred art that are meant to draw together heaven and earth, much like in Heidegger's example of the thinking things of the worlding world. So Foltz is left to a comic yet serious question. How are we to change the image, the icon through which we see the world, and unite our earthly life with heavenly realities? And could the earth itself even be itself an icon? Max Ohlschläger, who argued that only religions are truly motivating when it comes to inaugural changes in human society, was a friend of Foltz's and read his earlier book on Heidegger and ecology, and once asked him, what should we do next, even granted that everything Heidegger had to say was correct? Should we get to work teaching people how to think in Heideggerian manner, how to master Heidegger's unusual vocabulary, how to parse the Heideggerian distinctions so well that the earth would start to recover? For Foltz, this is a question at once comic and serious. Hölderlin himself had already provided the beginning of an answer by pointing to the major religions and their potential to change thought and attitude. Nevertheless, the talk about stewardship in the existing religious studies ecology literature seemed to him tepid and quite inadequate to the task. The idea of some new kind of quasi-religious consciousness being fashioned that could somehow provide more than a superficial, emotive kind of motivation for change seemed even less plausible. Foltz did, however, arrive at an answer to Hölderlin's question through proceeding somewhat more obliquely, addressing questions much like his, but as they had arisen from within the Heidegger book itself. The question here becomes one of applied environmental ethics versus Heidegger. Foltz notes that applied ethics as a professional field rests firmly upon modernity's truncated understanding of the ethical as concerning the relatively narrow sphere of moral obligation and its debates over the merits of various moral algorithms, whether deontological or utilitarian, and only subsequently seeks to extend itself back into the world of lived experience that it has, in fact, already left behind through its embrace of nature as an object of modern natural science. In contrast, Heidegger's understanding of ethics as concerning settlement, inhabitation, or the characteristic manner of human dwelling and being in the world, both recaptures the ancient scope of ethics and offers decisive hints for how philosophical thought could contribute towards more powerfully addressing environmental difficulties, seeing them not as resulting from incorrect moral judgments, but rather as failures in remembering what it means to dwell. And here we find a major theme that traverses the writings of Heidegger, as well as Emerson, Thoreau, William Burroughs, John Muir, Annie Dillard, and Wendell Berry, to name only a few. That is, to provide a deeper tonality and directive, must think more deeply about the topic of environmental aesthetics, the very relation between nature and what Foltz in his title calls the holy beauty of the visible. Just as environmental ethics presupposes authentic dwelling, and given that authentic dwelling is necessarily poetic or self-making, environmental ethics would indeed entail an environmental aesthetic. It's interesting that primarily contemplative, poetic voices such as these, most of whom long predate both the science of ecology as well as the voices of outright alarm in the 50s and 60s, such as in Rachel Carson's Silent Spring or Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb. These more poetic or aesthetic thinkers and their precursors in Romanticism and Transcendentalism, such as Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Hölderlin, Chateaubriand, and many others, as well as visual artists such as Caspar David Friedrich, Turner, and O'Keeffe, who have altogether most inaugurated our contemporary environmental consciousness. So could it be that an environmental aesthetic must ultimately entail something like an environmental theology? And how could this latter, an environmental aesthetico-theology, even be conceivable, given Nietzsche's Death of God, postmodernist critique? It is precisely this which it seems Nietzsche, Heidegger, and their postmodern successors make impossible. But is this really the whole story? Heidegger's two hints here on environmental issues concern first a poetic hint, the holy is Hölderlin's name for nature itself, so we must again learn to relate to nature as sacred. And second, that there must be a divine dimension, die Gottlichen, to any world structure that would allow us to save and preserve the earth. Heidegger's preferred world structure in his later writings being poetic dwelling in the fourfold. But where exactly should these two hints, nature as sacred and poetic dwelling in the fourfold, lead us? It was then, Foltz writes, shortly after the publication of his Heidegger book, that he began to discover what was for him a new and unanticipated continent of thought and spirituality, that of ancient Constantinople, the Byzantine East, and Russia, remarkably unexplored not only by myself, but at the same time by anyone within my personal or professional sphere of acquaintance. This became, after Heidegger, Foltz's path to the East. And here he made a remarkable discovery, and one that was hiding in plain sight. What Heidegger had taught Foltz to see, we found the same insight in Michael Northcott earlier in the course, is that there might be a hidden errancy or error, path of error, in ancient Greek thought itself, whose later elaborations came to bear toxic fruit in the modern world. More simply, Western Christianity took ancient Greek thought and repurposed its rationality, not only for a justification of faith, but also as the basis of science. What if in the East, scientizing tendency we find in later Greek philosophy, and the loss of the basic experience of physis simply had never occurred, or at least not in the same way. And what if finally Byzantine civilization remained the authentic inheritor of the archaic Greek experience of physis, built its theology in part on that basis? This is a pretty serious what if. Indeed, what Foltz finds in Byzantine culture, theology, philosophy, and spirituality is a sophisticated and superlatively rich civilization, whose very existence seems neither to be inferred nor even suspected in the writings of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, and their successors. And this despite the fact that they inspired impressive expressions of Byzantine culture as recently as in 19th and 20th century Russian thought, according to its own estimation, had carried on ancient traditions dating back to Constantinople. The implication here is that contemporary continental philosophy, indeed all of Western European culture, despite its fervent attempts to get over Christianity, has the whole while been getting over the specific form of Christianity that is Western, has simply not yet bothered to really engage with the Byzantine legacy and its rich experience in Russian philosophy, such as in the writings of Solovyov, who, to Heidegger's credit, he is aware of and speaks of in at least one essay. For Foltz, more Eastern Christian thought expresses a world where the visible and the invisible are conceived harmoniously rather than conflictually, a world where mythical and symbolic spirituality are the presupposition of rationality and reason, and a world where aesthetics embeds the central principles of epistemology and metaphysics, and a world where earth is not the springboard to heaven and thus not devalued, but is consecrated as our authentic home. Foltz wants to explore the surmise that the patriarch Bartholomew may have been right, and that our environmental crisis is ultimately a spiritual crisis, based at least in part upon philosophical theological missteps and spiritual atrophy. The Great Schism is still with us, and to heal Western Christianity in its relation to nature, what is needed, according to Foltz, is a renewed dialogue with Eastern Christian thought. And so Foltz fully develops these suggestions, which were only asides in White, only marginally developed in Northcott. We really immerse ourselves in Eastern Christian spirituality and religion, and ironically, we arrive at conclusions that appear very similar to those of the medieval historian Lynn White Jr., whose work has been so influential in this area, and who was in fact perhaps the first author to suggest that we needed a religious solution to our ecological crisis. Last week we found Caldecott ridiculing this suggestion. This week we're finding Bruce Foltz defending it. What the hidden errancy or toxic thought in relationship to nature, which Western philosophy and Christianity encodes, developing it from the Greeks, is a fundamental schism between two concepts or orders of nature. There is natura naturans, a Latin term meaning nature, naturing, nature as a verb, and this is the sort of nature we discovered in Hölderlin's hymn. And then there is the more underlined in Christian creationism concept of natura naturata, that is nature, nature as a product of divine creation. Taken for granted the whole course that Judeo-Christianity with its notion of a creator God establishes and imbues nature, and we've also fallen into naive oppositions between paganism and Christianity, the pagan conception of nature more aligning with natura naturans, and the Christian one with natura naturata. For Foltz, this whole mode of opposition of these two conceptual images of nature and of pagan versus Judeo-Christian is a wholly Western construct that entirely breaks down when we look to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And across the history of Western philosophy, natura naturans thus becomes the last hint in the West of the Eastern experience of divine energies in nature, collapses into natura naturata as a specific form in which nature is captured in the Western technological and theocratic hegemony. Although not informed by Eastern Christianity, Heidegger as well recalls this basic conflict in our experience of nature, the objective and the subjective, nature's priority or originality versus its having been produced, considers the ontology of nature be only accessible so far as we resist the pull of a world of mere things in which we flounder and are lost among beings. In fact, according to Foltz, what Heidegger's philosophy of nature, Eastern Orthodox conceptions share is an emphasis on the noetics of nature. And here Foltz introduces a more in-depth analysis of this term. He notes it is a coinage and an ancient Neoplatonic one from nous, mind, intelligence, and even spirituality. When we approach nature appropriately as dwellers, we undergo a thoughtful, intelligent spiritual experience or conversion that is a noesis of nature. And what Foltz wants to do is articulate the phenomenology of this experience. What does the phrase noetics of nature really mean? We are far too at ease in naive oppositions in our understanding of nature between immanence and transcendence, nature versus God, the invisible versus the visible, spirit versus nature. But what if the relationship of all these terms was more like a harmonious sacred marriage? And what if healing our religious and spiritual situation was the key to unlocking a more harmonious relationship between human spirituality and the natural environment? If we are honest with ourselves, we will acknowledge that materialism has failed. Not that it somehow collapsed, for it is certainly thriving in modern science, no doubt more widely than before, but what it has failed is humanity. Whole libraries could be assembled of works documenting how materialistic understandings of human existence are reductionistic and dehumanizing. Has modern materialism failed nature as well? It will be countered that nature essentially is material, lending itself naturally to a materialist approach. And such views go back to the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus and are still very much in currency today. And yet for Foltz, the modern concept of matter, its often tacit metaphysics of a lifeless, passive, self-contained, and self-subsistent material substrate that alone is really real, differs radically from the intermittent manifestations of materialism in pre-modern thought. Materialism of the modern scientists is not at all like the still quite spiritual materialism of an author like Lucretius in his On the Nature of Things. Lucretius, of course, being an Epicurean philosopher, heavily indebted to Epicurean physics, which as well reserved an important role for the spirituality implicit in nature, even as it combated the stultifications of religion. Foltz writes, Lucretius's text On the Nature of Things, a classic of nature writing, draws us back into our experience of lived nature, ever attentive to the beauty of the prescribed and proper ways of nature, the ways specific to the things themselves, and always reverent towards the reality of the divine. What modern materialism does is that it ignores all duty to save and shelter the phenomena of nature and even assumes that things have no nature. It is anti-essentialist through an unrelenting reductionism. And even Edmund Husserl, the founder of European phenomenology, notes that the modern natural sciences have burnt the bridge between lived reality, that is our life worlds, and a scientific world conception. Extreme scientific reductionism has become a worldview and a way of life in Western civilization and society, but nowhere else. Well, everywhere else, but only through globalization. Only Western or Western-influenced societies routinely, quote, violate nature and treat the functional modesty of nature licentiously for the sake of an extremely risky, reckless, and short-sighted utilitarianism. So next we get some very interesting reflections about ancient versus modern theory, i.e. thinking noetics of nature. Modern theory, as we all know, is a worldview that implies the theory or seeing of the real. However, ancient theory was more contemplative and a way of life. Very often a mystical seeing of the invisible within the invisible, a denotation that it continues to carry to this day in the ascetic theology of Greek Orthodox spirituality, where theory is used to describe the activity taking place within cliffside caves and hermitages on Mount Athos, as much as what is undertaken in the research laboratories of Athens or Thessalonica. The term theoria is rooted in theisthai, the seeing that was once associated with theater. Ancient theory was attentive and experientially engaged. Theoroi were most commonly ambassadors to sacred festivals who actively participated in the spectacles they beheld by offering sacrifices, by taking part in the dances and games that formed an integral part of the practice of divine worship. This old way of seeing or theory we can also call noetics. There is here, to be sure, a certain optics. It is not a reductive optics of the visible elements that are manifest, nor of the invisible elements that elude the perception of the senses, nor of the darkness and mystery that still remain. Rather, ancient theory or noetics apprehends the rootedness of the visible in the invisible, and here for Foltz, the noetic suggests illuminations, revelations full of significance and importance, which offer insight into depths of truths unplumbed by the discursive intellect. And so Foltz will use the term noetic in the sense, in his Noetics of Nature here, Foltz will use the term noetic more in the sense of Plato's divided line analogy, in which the visible becomes iconic and serves as an image for the invisible, through which the visible is in turn illuminated. This use of the term noetic, deriving from Plato's Republic, divided line, that is, the sensible and intellectual worlds, and myth of the cave, is precisely that tradition taken up through Neoplatonism into the Byzantine Philokalia. Here in the Philokalia, still the basic text of Greek Orthodox spirituality, Noetics refers to the spiritual apprehension of the invisible that can take place when the nous, the cosmic mind, has returned from entanglement in passion-driven thoughts to its proper home, human-heartedness, the heart, cardia, that is, thinking from the heart as the true center of human life, or thinking from the eye of the heart. Foltz can't resist here that this is precisely what Heidegger means by Denken, thinking, and mindfulness, Besinnung, in his later work. Architect Robert Hale has called something of this sort simply the old way of seeing, thus suggesting that this noetic contemplative seeing, far from being exotic or contrived, was very much the elaboration and intensification of an accustomed, everyday mode of seeing that was once shared more commonly. Hale also believes that this old way of seeing prevailed in predominantly agrarian America until around the 1830s. He cites Emerson as one of the figures who document its decline due to the growing prevalence of a calculative, mechanistic, mercantile, and above all mediated way of seeing. Emerson, as we read last week, saw the rise of a new commercialism that put calculation ahead of spirit. He protested in the stirring opening lines of his 1836 essay Nature that the foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. Why should we not also enjoy an original relation to the universe? By the mid-19th century, Karl Marx was boasting that such archaic mythic consciousness cannot seriously compete with steam engines and locomotives. Still later in the 19th century, one of the fathers of sociology, Max Weber, conceptualized the transition from archaic seeing to instrumentalized seeing, his concept of the disenchantment and Zauberung of the world, which he saw as the inevitable consequence of its growing rationalization. The world is disenchanted when seeing is replaced by calculation, in such a way that calculation becomes the new way of seeing. American poet laureate and pioneer environmentalist and farmer, Wendell Berry, documents this loss of the old way of seeing extensively when it comes to traditional agriculture, and demonstrates how place-sensitive, sympathetic, intuitive seeing of the land has always produced better, more sustainable results than modern agri-science and agribusiness. James Barr as well documents the loss of the old way of seeing when he looks to Polynesian seafarers who used to be able to sail remarkable distances while navigating only by recourse to such subtleties as the smell of the air, the behavior of the birds, cetaceans, and the taste of the sea itself. The loss of this old way of seeing is indeed an immense loss, and along with it, the materialization and flattening and disenchantment of nature, i.e. the modern erosion of the living organic life world that would sustain a noetics of nature, proceeds in full force. More simply, if the world is re-enchanted, and if our life worlds within nature are sustained, then a noetics of nature or recognition of its indwelling spirituality become inevitable. However, these roots of our culture and history have been deracinated. This begins much earlier than the rise of modernity, so it's important to understand the roots or etiology of this decline, i.e. the decline of our noetic relation to nature. Next, in this astonishing introduction, Foltz turns to the noetics of nature in ancient Greece and notes that for the earliest Greeks, the spiritual seeing of nature was mythological. Their gods were radically and powerfully immanent, saturating every aspect of life and nature with what classical scholar Walter Friedrich Otto calls the marvelous delineations of the divine, to grant depth and weight to every aspect of nature. And the Greek gods were manifest everywhere in nature, in the power of the thunderbolt, the raging of the sea, the dizzying intoxication of love, the exhilaration of the hunt, the quiet goodness of fertility and fecundity of the earth. In each case, the gods were revealed in the forms of the natural as their very essence and being. The Godhead was a manifestation, the very sightedness or locality of nature. However, at the same time, the Greeks also often saw nature as a potential arena of incoherence and menace, of wilderness, propitiated and sacrificed to in appropriate ways. They were at once enmeshed in nature and terrified of it at the limits of their comprehension. And so the earliest noetics of nature in ancient Greece, such as in Hesiod's Theogony, or the Homeric hymns as well encode patriarchal triumphalism over nature, a misogynistic fear of its feminine and engendering potencies. Promised earlier a more accessible account, the relation of nature as chaos, spirit as law or song in Friedrich Hölderlin according to Heidegger. And here in Foltz we're going to get it by turning again to Walter Friedrich Otto. Foltz Otto had argued that there are in fact two competing principles of unity in nature. One, a retrograde principle reaching back to the archaic deities, dark and disturbing and elemental, grounded in Gaia or Earth, and ultimately in chaos which engenders all, and even Earth itself. This is called in Greek religion the chthonic. It's more associated with chaos, its dark and disturbing dimensions, and ultimately with nature itself, and the feminine deities who primarily engender the whole of the cosmos, and everything within it, above all Gaia. The other locus of nature, more associated with nomos, law, song, spirit, is according to Otto, Olympian, heavenly, localized above all in one increasingly transcendent god, Zeus. Still the fire and light striking down from the heaven in the thunderbolt, but increasingly the pristine serenity of the Godhead, and eventually understood as wielding power even over fate or Moira, once thought to be beyond the power of the gods. This nomos dimension is understood in archaic Greek culture as the Uranian, the spiritual as such over and against nature, and it comes to predominate. It was Greek philosophy, Foltz underlines, that sought to unify these two tendencies, chthonic versus Uranian, chaos versus nomos. The Greek philosophers from the pre-Socratics through Plato and Aristotle into their Hellenistic inheritors understood the development of spiritual intelligence to be our unencumbered exercise of that highest faculty of alertness and heedfulness and comprehension, which they gave the name mind or nous, a noun that we can render variously as intellectual intuition, immediate apprehension, mens or mind, or a rendering prepared, open, attentive consciousness. Nous, the root of the later Neoplatonic term Noetics, Foltz thus defines as a heedful awareness that is open to the presence of the invisible within the visible, i.e. a kind of divinity within nature. And of course, the connection of nous with transcendence, spirituality, and above all mysticism is hard to miss for anyone not dedicated to the modern project of reading the philosophers of Greek antiquity as Enlightenment philosophes. Foltz is saying here in a very sophisticated way that we tend to understand Greek philosophy as the dawn of reason and science. This is entirely anachronistic and a misreading. The ancient Greek philosophers were not at all like our Enlightenment philosophes. Rather, they were one and all engaged in a project of deepening the noetics of nature. The scope, depth, and power of Foltz's historical interpretations here are pretty awe-inspiring. We next hear, according to Brand, that Heraclitus sees his divinity, the wisdom that wants and does not want to be called Zeus in all appearances of the natural world. And Heraclitus is, in this sense, much more an ecological thinker than Parmenides and Plato, who both privilege the metaphor of ascent. Parmenides, sometimes called the father of logic, in his proem ascends from earth into the heavens like some shaman riding on a chariot of moonlight, there to fully realize in the presence of a goddess the noetic vision that he faithfully discloses to the hearers of his proem. And Plato's Republic as well, taking its model from Parmenides and Pythagoras, charts an ascent from Hades, from the lower segment of the divided line, the sensible world, from the depth of the cave, and from earthly embodiment to sunlight in heaven. The peak of such ascents is always noesis itself, as the highest seeing of what is highest. Of course, in turn, the privileging of the supersensible, the invisible, the spiritual, over the sensible, the visible, and the natural in Western thought. But why give credence to this metaphor of ascent? Where has the dark soil of the earth, the chthonic, gone in the work of Parmenides and Plato? Privilege of the invisible, the spiritual, over the natural was so powerful in Greek philosophy that after Plato remains as a residue even in the naturalist Aristotle. Aristotle's model of thought, noesis, both the knower and the known share together in an ascent from the visible into the invisible, away from materiality towards an abstract divinity whose relation to the immanent is removed at many levels, and so is described as an unmoved mover and understood as nothing more than an ethereal, disengaged, noetic reflexivity, who acts and is known only indirectly from a metaphysical distance. Instead of a rich embodiment beholden to Demeter, Persephone, and the Eleusinian mysteries, we find in Aristotle a union with divine agency itself and a privileging of pure noetic activity, a term in Aristotle which becomes agent intellect in Latin renderings, and which is now engaged in nothing more than apprehending its own apprehension. And here Foltz underlines the critical importance of Heraclitus, remember the thinker, nature loves to hide itself, for the development of those branches of early Christian theology that most informed the Greek Orthodox legacy. In Parmenides' quest for being and truth, nature became the deceptive fork in the road, the pathway of natural becoming, the road not to be taken, the way of nothingness. And in Plato, the very notion of nature, physis, had advanced to the status of what is not quite nothingness, but still a marginal realm of partial truth, the ontological equivalent of the underworld or Hades. So far as we are in nature, we are not yet born to the world of truth in the forms. Thus the realm of meon, neither fully being nor fully non-being. And for all his return to the natural sciences, in Aristotle nothing has really changed. Aristotle never challenges the Platonic notion that it is visibility or form, the eidos, and freedom from the passivity and materiality of the earth that is the criteria for true being and the genuine philosopher. A more physis and nature enmeshed theology, rooted in the hints of Heraclitus, have to await its revival and transformation in the experience and thought of early Christianity. Foltz begins to make some very interesting connections between Heraclitus' Logos doctrine, such statements as "listen not to me, but to the Logos," and admit that all things are one, becomes of decisive importance for the Christian theological interpretation of the Logos in St. John. In the beginning was the Word. There are in fact many influences on the Logos of St. John, including Stoic doctrines of language and ancient Judaic ones. And this is all worth exploring. But what Foltz wants to underline paradoxically is how the specifically Heraclitean Logos, connected to the way of nature and becoming, and experienced viscerally in a world oriented by divinity, wisdom, and Zeus, is closer to the way Greek Orthodox spirituality understands the nativity icon than we might expect. Classical philosophy had become a trajectory of restless, almost obsessive transcendence, and into this conception, Christianity emerges as an interruption in this tradition of Noetics to offer a peaceful image, icon of the nativity, a different face of being, that God has really entered into creation through the incarnation as Yeshua, precisely means that God has not appeared by proxy like some ephemeral projection, but rather come into being within the earthly, that is, within the realm of physis, or Heraclitean becoming. Nativity icon or nature as the divine incarnation of God in the person of Christ is thus the iconographic core of the Christian East and reflects a predilection for subterranean imagery. The eternal Logos enters substantially into creation, canonically, emptying itself, but innocently as in a child, while deep within the earth, in a cave, there is a birthplace into which is written the essential materiality of the earth, the signs of spirit and nature. For Foltz, incarnation or embodiment itself is taking place within the earth as principle of all embodiment. Home and inhabitation and immanence on the one hand, and divinity, transcendence, and longing on the other are no longer incommensurate fields of meaning, metaphysical oil and water as it were, but are held in serene balance. And here Foltz is very much not an orthodox Heideggerian, but rather a post-Heideggerian Byzantine Christian. Throwing off the Catholicism of his youth and dabbling a while in Protestantism, Heidegger abandoned theology for philosophy and what Being and Time calls the atheism of thinking, nevertheless continuing to write rich phenomenological and historical works on how the religious phenomena of the past encode dimensions of the sending of being and its truth. Conceptual edges of his own philosophy, he would often claim naively and wrongly that there is no such thing as a Christian philosophy, that it is merely a contradiction in terms. The basis of Christianity is not in fact Greek logos, but Abrahamic faith. Foltz's innovation here is to point out, while Heidegger may be correct in regards to some aspects of the history of Western Christianity, although as we've seen in this course, not all, the Heideggerian gesture of separating Greek philosophy from Christian faith as non-philosophy does not fare so well when applied to the roots and development of Orthodox spirituality and theology. The nativity icon being situated perfectly as icon or image of the divine, absolute, or truth within the debates raging within classical thought itself. Christ in this sense becoming an answer, as well as a self-overcoming from within the earth of Plato's otherworldly hopes and ideological fantasies. As well in the resurrection icon, deep in the earth, in the realm of the invisible or Hades, Christ arises, raising up Adam and Eve and bringing humanity from death to life. And here again, cave and earth, or the chthonic, are central, like at Eleusis. And we cannot even, within the Byzantine approach, the nativity and resurrection icon, speak of what came to be known as the Western difference between the theology of glory, emphasizing theoretical wonder, and the theology of the cross, emphasizing sacrifice and redemption of the human soul. Both these themes being encoded in metaphors in which the earthly and the natural predominate precisely as Christ, or the moment in which humanity and divinity, earth and heaven, are reunited with the mysterious space and time that conjoins the temporal events of Holy Saturday with the abyss of eternity. According to Foltz, in both the Nativity and the Resurrection, light is brought into the very cave itself, and this could not be further removed from the ethereal metaphysics of classical Greek philosophy. For in Plato, the icon or image is the lowest stage of the divided line, leading from the visible towards the invisible, but in the orthodox icon, it is just the opposite. The image here draws the invisible down into the very thicket of the visible, and this includes human beings in their fleshly material embodiment. Foltz finds in this rich tradition of Byzantine and Russian iconography a remarkable and largely forgotten change in the very mode of our experiencing of nature and materiality, a change whose spiritual sensibilities have been quietly preserved and cultivated for 2 millennia. And drawing now from the work of Peter Brown, there are 3 consequences to this. 1. In the East at least, nature was by no means desanctified with the rise of Christian civilization. Rather, places became resanctified. 2. Overflowing with a new kind of spiritual energy that they were eager to cultivate, large numbers of the faithful withdrew to deserts, first those of Egypt, and then those of Palestine and Cappadocia. And for the first time, wilderness, rather than just the domesticated nature of Plato's Phaedrus or Virgil's Georgics, came to be seen as aesthetically meaningful, while providing a more adequate home for the intensive spiritual activity that was not possible within the city walls. And 3, as a corollary, these wild places came to be seen as offering to the noetic eye an ancient testimony as constituting the first original scriptures preceding those of Moses, and this apprehension not of dark gods, nor of a distant demiurge, but of divine order and meaning immanent and visible within creation, giving rise, long before Galileo, to the first articulation of nature as a book to be read, in the thought of Saint Anthony the Great during the 4th century CE. Most significantly and even astonishingly of all, Foltz suggests, quoting from Pavel Florensky, it was only during this period of early Byzantine Christianity nature was finally seen as deeply revelatory of divine truth. The whole phenomena of being in love with creation gets invented. So it's to Byzantine Christianity that we owe the very concept of love of nature, and where it first emerged into Western consciousness. This is an enormous claim. Of course, meditation on love, and even the love of nature, not entirely foreign to ancient Greek thought. Lesser-known pre-Socratic philosopher Timocles of Elea, in fact, emphasizes this theme, as does Empedocles of Akrakas. It is certainly also the case that love of nature is not the theme first in rank in ancient Greek philosophy as a whole, not even in the Stoic doctrine of living in accordance with nature. And so in my view, there's a definite plausibility to this claim that it was the early Eastern Christian reconceptualization of nature through the Nativity and the Resurrection, and as bespeaking God's love, gave rise to a new notion of the love of nature, not yet seen in the earlier history of philosophy. But despite these fascinating contributions and rich traditions to the present day, Byzantine and Syriac traditions are largely unstudied in the Latinized Christian West. Their perspective on spirit and nature was largely eclipsed by the conceptual lens of Latin scholasticism, i.e. the very tradition that Heidegger railed against, causing him to abandon the very notion of Christian philosophy. In fact, the West had to reinvent immanent theology only recently, while the East had always encountered the activity of the mysterious and transcendent God, encountering not the divine essence as such, but the divine energia, everywhere immanent in nature, to those whose hearts had been healed and purified. Threefold path laid out by Eastern Orthodox Christianity is indeed, according to Foltz, an imminent theology of salvation, privileging neither glory or the cross, but rather a threefold path involving 1. Catharsis, or purification of the soul, 2. The area or noesis, contemplation of the divine energies, and 3. The mystical moment of theosis as a union with God and divinization of the person, body, and soul. And so in Eastern Christian philosophy, it is always the purified soul that engages in noetic contemplation, or what the Greeks called theoria physica, contemplation of nature. Rather than being grounded on the philosophic candor and faith-seeking understanding of St. Augustine, the roots of Orthodox philosophy and spirituality date back to Dionysius the Areopagite, an early church father and most likely 6th century Syrian monk who suggests that the cosmos we find around us, since it precisely is divine revelation intended for us, is the only world we are meant to know, and who thereby substitutes a Platonic movement of ascent away from the world for the understanding that spiritual progress will consist in moving forever more deeply into the rich symbolism of the created order. It is on these Dionysian roots that the Byzantine understanding of nature and grace, of the visible and the invisible, as mutually interpenetrating realms, a marriage of heaven and earth, got going, only to then reach its fullest articulation in the thought of Maximus the Confessor, 7th century monk who saw the incarnation of God as bringing to perfection the very metaphysical structure of the created order. Next, Foltz notes how this noetics of nature never really took hold in the Latin West, with the one limited exception of Celtic Christianity, whose remoteness from the centers of Western ecclesiastical influence helped to preserve the sense of a proximity of heaven to earth, even after the Norman conquest sought to incorporate the Celtic lands into the Latin domain. In contrast to this tradition, Western Christianity seems at times almost to forget nature, at least in its core doctrines, as in Theodulf's Libri Carolina, which argued that the sacred, invisible, and heavenly is better encountered in books than in nature. Or eventually Aquinas, who will not allow even that last remnant of direct knowing God that Anselm had found in his ontological argument. In Duns Scotus, nature is in fact flattened in the depth dimension of its being in order to maintain the doctrine of the univocity of being, to deny the participation of the created order in the divine being, thus emphasizing the radical transcendence of God. William of Ockham radicalized the Scotist uprooting of the visible from the invisible by making nature a mere given, a self-subsisting artifact whose only link to the Creator lies in the capricious will of a God who chooses to create this world rather than some other. And it is thus in the scholastic tradition from Theodulf to William of Ockham that the way is paved for Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and all the heralds of the disenchanted nature of modernity. That the beauty, goodness, and order of nature could be windows opening upon divinity, epiphanies of the divine being itself, was gradually obscured in Western thought and remains so to this day. So Foltz arrives, nearing to the end of his introduction, at the aporias of late modernity. We have, since the Renaissance, been attempting to articulate a different sense of nature. Nature as a being in some way bearing the spirit and a visible icon of the invisible. And these developments intensified in the 19th century in German idealism, British Romanticism, and American Transcendentalism, as we studied last week, all of which returned to the mythological texts of non-Christian civilizations as writings that evoked a world saturated with divinity. It is from these roots that American nature writing comes to abound in an invigorated sense of divine immanence in nature, from Thoreau and Emerson to Muir, Dillard, Lopez, Nabham, and Wendell Berry. Nor is it for Foltz a coincidence that the language of this genre abounds with words like attentiveness and seeing and wonder, that is the very language of ancient theoria. Moreover, it seems that 20th century environmental movements more authentically trace their genealogy to these poetic, spiritual, noetic visionaries than to more recent findings of the natural sciences. Environmental philosophy, however, has lagged behind, often remaining content with approaches derived from ecosystemic concepts and methodologies that, however helpful they may be in remedying some immediate difficulty or other, reflect the very flattening of nature that constitutes the larger problem. So for Foltz, the turn to poetry of nature, in the Romantic period and beyond, is a necessary step along the road to recovering the noetics of nature, a noetics which Eastern Christianity in fact never lost. Indeed, in the West, a noetics of nature is still lacking, though it could be said that Schelling and even Hegel made this attempt. Most environmental thought today looks to the presumptive positivism of the sciences. This philosophical divorce of transcendence and immanence began with the pre-Socratics, notably Parmenides. Plato attempted to bridge the chasm, doctrine of participation in the forms, methexis, sensible world of nature participating in the divine world of the forms. Aristotle with his doctrine of being as energia, that is the priority of actuality over potentiality, eventually morphing into the reduced form, the physical principle of the conservation of energy. Images of the marriage in heaven and earth are not lacking in Western Christianity, but at the same time they were very often pushed to the margins, which is in the suppression of Gnostic scriptures, and they do not form the core of the theology as they do in Eastern Orthodox thought. By and large, Western thought instead reinstantiates the priority of heaven rather than the priority of nature, common to both ancient Greek religion and the history of Byzantine Christianity. And in this sense, Nietzsche was correct when he stated that Western Christianity is a popularized Platonism. We do not need to abandon the old doctrine of the priority of physis or nature in order to be authentic Christians. We simply need to learn the traditions of the history of Christianity, which are not the specifically Western ones, which ended up by and large emphasizing the priority of heaven and spirit. Remnants of these ancient Orthodox solutions to the relation of transcendence and immanence surfaced intermittently in Renaissance philosophy under the rubrics of Platonism and Hermeticism, and this even as the art of the time moved towards realism. It still presented nature not as porous to transcendence, but as opaque and self-sufficing. Gradually, however, modern science moves from seeing the laws of nature as insights into the transcendent wisdom and perfection immanent to the world, to a purely operational empirical study of regularities that happen to be as we find them to be, and which we're free to exploit as we please without the hindrance of transcendent considerations. So British empiricism emerges after Francis Bacon and favors the scientific method of observation, just as continental rationalism tries to preserve a weaker sense of noetics, for example in the self-knowing substance of Spinoza or the monadology of Leibniz. Immanuel Kant appears and attempts to reconcile the traditions of British empiricism and continental rationalism. His hard-won effort to separate the transcendent or noumenal sphere from the conditions of experience is short-lived and soon rebuffed by German idealism, which goes further to refuse both immanence and transcendence in its new doctrine of the subject. I think that it is at the same time all creation, and before too long, divine transcendence wins out again in Hegel's logic. The rise of phenomenology, transcendence, and immanence are again rethought, but in a more limited sense. And so postmodernists speak of a return to religion, Gianni Vattimo, or the theological turn, Dominique Janicot, and of a radical, irreducible, intractable transcendence, often under the rubric of the other, such as Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida. This is the lineage of transcendence in postmodernism, where other postmodern philosophers go back to immanence, in the Hegelian, Spinozist, Nietzschean, or Deleuzian mode. But across this history, from phenomenology to postmodernism, it barely registers to any of these thinkers that we might go back to a noetics of nature, ecology, and a spiritual earth. The depth dimensions of nature remain closed. Crucially, in Foltz's judgment, it is only Heidegger who seems to obsess over them among the continental philosophical giants. Heidegger's philosophical work serves as a powerful and perhaps even exemplary noetics of nature. Even his themes of the thing and the fourfold explored earlier in this lecture bring us back to the encounter with the inner meaning or poetic logos of simple, everyday realities that surround us, trees and mountains, the sky and the earth. The limit here is that in the early work as much as in the later, transcendence often wins out as the image of thought, nature itself being approached only from being or the event of being, Ereignis, and thus only mantically, that is incantationally and poetically. It can perhaps be conceded that rather than a noetics, Heidegger outlines something more like a poetics of nature. We in fact need Eastern Christian philosophy in order to answer the question, where is the natural environment in all this? Heidegger acknowledges that Western philosophy has not yet been able to let a tree actually be a tree. Alas, in Heidegger, the isness of the tree overwhelms the tree itself. And here there may be much to recommend hesychastic watchfulness or Buddhist mindfulness, sati, over Heideggerian mindfulness and thinking, which tends to privilege the mantra of being, the priority of being over beings or the ontological difference. What this overlooks for Foltz is that the Nautilus is, in fact, more remarkable than the fact that the desk chair is. He agrees with Heidegger that the world existing at all is a cause for wonder, but how much more wonderful is this reality itself in how it exists, and how wonderful it can be. This is in Foltz a return after Heidegger to the ontic. If we are on the search for a noetics of nature rather than poetics of nature in Heidegger, the most productive text would be the Country Path, in which many passages suggest the noetics of nature, which is still locked at times in Heidegger's preferred modes of Aristotelian contemplation. In some ways, Heidegger blocked his own path to noetics because he was afraid of an exclusively factical or existential approach to life and being. So he more emphasizes transcendence, how being always predominates as beyond mere presence. And in this way, Heidegger remained committed, despite himself, to Luther's theology of the cross. The cross becomes factical life, or the ontic, so as to avoid the pitfalls of the Western theology of glory, a theology which in the East was never lost, rather developed along more integral and holistic paths. That there could have been another kind of noetics or contemplation of nature not only remains within the factical everyday life of Dasein, but intensifies it, fulfills it, and radicalizes it, Heidegger seems not to have considered, except perhaps in his preference for the pastoral life and villagers of the Black Forest over the company of colleagues. And so Foltz concludes this marvelous introduction, and I hope you're inspired to pick up the whole text with an articulation of where he's going. Thus, given its absence, even in the work of Heidegger, a philosophical retrieval of the noetics of nature, especially in its most ancient and integral expressions, would be a task of great urgency in an age in which our alienation from nature presents us with consequences that can no longer be ignored. Thomas Traherne, the 17th century English poet, wrote, "You never enjoy the world aright till you see how a grain of sand exhibiteth the wisdom and the power of God." How we treat the natural world around us, the environment, as environmental science calls it, creation, ktisis, and cosmos, as the ancient Jews and Greeks and early Christians call it, follows effortlessly, quietly, but inexorably from the way we conceive it, from our relation to it, thus affirming the statement of Bartholomew, providing a new kind of response to Lynn White. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture on place, poetry, and the noetics of nature in Heidegger or Heidegger's Hölderlin and Bruce Foltz, his return to Byzantine Christianity. And I'll see you next week, when we'll cover more scientific contemporary takes on nature, spirit, and the environment by looking to Gaia theory in Lovelock, Margulis, and their inheritors such as Bruno Latour. See you then.